We mentioned this from time to time, but our purpose statement, the reason why we exist as a church is to know Christ and to make Christ known. And that making Christ known part, that includes local evangelism, things like the Harvest Festival that we're doing here in a few weeks, and Awana, and all the other various outreach ministries that we have. But it also includes our international outreach ministries. I was privileged to go on 2 short-term trips to see 2 of our international missionaries this year down to Oaxaca with the team, and Tyson and I went down to Indonesia to see David. And what an incredible privilege we have this morning of hearing from another of our international missionaries, Steve Vinton. Steve and Susan have been in Africa probably longer than I've been alive, or at least close to that, something along those lines. And our church has been involved with them, certainly ever since they began Village Schools International. And it is an absolutely incredible story, what's happened with this ministry. And Steve and I got to sit down for a couple hours this week and just talk about that and reminisce, think about the future as well. Steve's one of my favorite people just to be around. And whenever he's in country, I just love getting to spend whatever time with him that I can. For the last 14 years since I've been here, Steve has asked us as a church to do 2 things. He has asked us to pray that God would open doors for the ministry in Africa. And he has asked us to pray that God would send workers. And for 14 years, Steve, every Wednesday morning, that has been my prayer for your particular ministry. And I know that's true of many of us. We're just so thankful for the work you're doing, for our privilege really of partnering with you in that. So we just can't wait to hear what you have to say. I'm going to invite you to come up. We're going to put a slide up here on the screen. When we have missionaries come to speak, so whether it's Steve or the Merchants or the Tornas, one of the things that we want to encourage you to do is to support their ministry financially. So we do, and we think it's worth supporting. That QR code will take you to the donation page for Village Schools. And we believe in this, and we want everybody to get involved. So we want to make sure that we put that up there so you guys could see that and considering being a part of what Steve's doing there, Steve and Susan. Also, if you wanted to just write a check or something like that, you can just write that in the memo line, and we will make sure that gets right over to their ministry. But without further ado then, Steve.
You know, when Drew said that it's been since the beginning, it really in many ways has been since the beginning with this church. And I know that a lot of people maybe are new here or have been here in the last 5 years or something like that. But I thought before I began sharing with you what I really feel God put on my heart for this morning, I wanted to give you a little bit of history, just so you can understand how this has all come together. You see, Susan and I were missionaries in Congo when there was a war. And it was because of that war that we fled the country where we believe God had called us to work. And we ended up in this neighboring country of Tanzania. And we were introduced to a world that was very foreign to us, very different from the Africa that we knew. There were a few churches in villages. There were almost no schools. Very little opportunity for anyone to get any medical care. The country to us was seemingly, I will be honest, unbelievably poor. We're Christian people. We looked at the situation that we saw there, and it hurt inside to look at it. It was in 1999 that we showed up there in Tanzania, running away from that war, and we were taken in by kind people, very kind. We were going to help out in a little Bible school that was there in that village. There was that primary school that was there also. It was like out of a movie. The mud floors. Not even a blackboard. It was black paint painted on a mud wall. All those kids All they wanted was a chance in life. And we were there in that village when those kids took the national examinations. They studied their hearts out. And out of 46 kids, the government chose 2 of them to get to go to the 8th grade. That was the beginning. That was the seed of village schools. When we looked at that situation and we said, this is simply not right. Doesn't matter if the government doesn't do anything about it. It doesn't matter if the United Nations, all the big companies, all the big charities, we're Christian people. It is not right that 44 kids never get to go to school again. And that was the seed that started this thing we call village schools today. We started with a little school. We had a big meeting. Everybody came, and we talked about all the schools that we had in Congo. We had 62 high schools, 30,000 kids in school. That those kids, they were the ones who then, when they graduated, they worked in the medical clinics. They were the ones who started businesses. They were the ones who were the backbones of their churches, who were able to give because they had salaries. And we started our little school with 14 kids. They called them later on the brave ones. But 4 years later, we had 602 kids in that school because we went to every village. We wanted every kid to come, every boy, every girl. You have shoes, come. You don't, come anyway. Your parents can help you, come. Your parents are already dead, come anyway. A school for everyone. Not just for the straight A kids, for the kids who get B's and C's and D, even the kids who get F's, even the kids who have given up. Come. That was 1999. In 2005, the first kids who graduated, they were the ones who started village schools. The organization now is called Village Schools International, because we had to create something back here in America. But it was started in 2005 by a group of our former students. It was called Village Schools Tanzania. They came to us to tell us that they believed that God had given them the job to do in villages all around the country what we had come and done in their village. And that one day, everyone would get to go to school like they got to go to school. I was their math teacher, so I plugged their great plan into the spreadsheet. And it said that if they went off and started that first school someplace, and then the next year they'd go start another one, and then they'd ramp up to doing 2 a year, and then 3 a year, and at the end of 20 years, they would have 56 schools. And so that was the dream, and that was the dream that we came and told people in this church about. A glimpse of what we thought God wanted to do. It was easily what anyone who was reasonable and realistic would have called pie in the sky. For a bunch of kids in villages to start 56 secondary schools? But this church was part of churches around this country who believed that maybe this really was what God wanted us to do. That was 2005. It didn't work out at all like we planned. They didn't start 1 school that first year. They started 3. And then it just spread. If everything had worked out according to those grandiose plans, we would get to 2025 and we would have those 56 schools open. Well, in 2021, they opened the 57th school. And that was when they set a new goal that maybe God wanted them to run at double the pace and to try and open 6 a year. And so they said, we'll try and open 60 more before the end of this decade. Well, this last month, they opened their 87th school. These are all schools in villages. For the kids at the bottom, they're called Wasiochaguliwa, the unchosen ones. That's what they all have in common. They weren't good enough to get one of those special slots to get sent away for the 8th grade. And instead, people come in villages and they work for months and months, and they make bricks, and they haul foundation stones, and they haul sand, and they carry water, and they build schools. And the thing that is different about these schools than any other schools is that there's never an admissions test. There's never an essay to write. There's never anything that gets to choose who's good enough to come. The schools are for absolutely everyone. And today they have 18,517 kids in those schools. And that's as of Friday. I know there'll be more on Monday. And the reason is that on the weekends, the teachers go out and they go and look for the kids who aren't in any school and get them to come. That's what your church has been a part of for all these years. That's what I want to serve as an introduction so you can understand the scriptures that I want us to look at this morning. You see, when I went to Tanzania, I went first and foremost as a missionary. We wanted to share with people the knowledge of the true and living God. Now, you folks are blessed in this country. Whether people are Christians or not, there's been so much talk already all around everywhere that people have this idea that there is one God. And they know some things about that God, even if they're a little bit confused about it. Even people who don't come here, they have this idea that God is good. Well, I live in a different world. I live in Africa. I took my kids to Tanzania. You know, out of the mouths of babes, I remember when we are going one day and we are traveling and we are down in the valley, the Rukwa Valley, and my son Joshua is there in the car, and we're looking out, and as we're going by these fields, Joshua is seeing in all the fields there are these they're like little huts. And finally, Joshua says, "What are those?" And Godfrey, who is in the car, says, "Oh, those are what people build for their gods." And there was silence in the car as Joshua's thinking about this. And then he says, "Their gods must be very small." Yes, their gods are very small. But what I learned is it doesn't matter if the god of the Wafipa is called Katai, and the god where we came from among the Warega is called Kimbirikiti in Congo. It doesn't. All of these gods are the same. The god of the Warega couldn't leave the forest. You could get away from him if you went to the city. The Wafipa, they took their offerings up into the hills because Katai was up in the hills. But all these gods, they're the ones who kill the children. They're the ones you go and you take the offerings to appease so that maybe your crops will grow this year and the rains will come. How do we get from that concept of who God is, where every tribe has its own little God that they can manipulate and appease, to the majesty of the kind of things that we sang this morning? The true and living God, the majesty of our God, the greatness of our God. But there are hard things to understand about this true God. Very hard things. You see, it's not just that the true God is righteous and good and wonderful. He expects us also to be that way. It's not a matter of appeasing him. It's different. The news about the true God actually doesn't start out as very good news. We talk about the gospel. And Village Schools is all about taking the gospel. And I'm a missionary who goes, I want to share the gospel. But the gospel, the good news, the news of the true God, doesn't start out as very good news. Do you know what Romans 6:23 says? For the wages of sin is death. You see, God, the true God, that's what we have to tell people. The true God expects us all to be righteousness, and when we sin, there's no way of appeasing it. The wages of sin is death. That's the news of the true God. That's the news of the true God. The news of the fake gods is that those gods do bad things, and so we have to figure out how to get them to not do so many bad things to us. That's the news of the fake gods. But the news of the true God is that God not only expects us not to sin, but that the wages of sin is death. And it's pretty easy for everyone to accept what Romans 3:23 says, that it's all of us, because everybody knows that we're all bad. That's not a hard one. That one's really easy. But that's the news that we have to take to people. The true God. But here's the thing, and if you turn with me to Romans chapter 5, this is the incredible message that we have to take. Yes, it is true. The true and living God, he is different from all the fake gods. It is true. He wants us to be righteous, and yes, the penalty, the wages of sin, it's death. But Romans chapter 5, starting in verse 6, is an incredible message. It's an incredible message. It says, you see, at just the right time, when we were still powerless, Christ died for the ungodly. Very rarely will anyone die for a righteous man. Though for a good man, someone might possibly dare to die. But God demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. That is the incredible contradiction, the unbelievable thing about the true God. The true God is so righteous. He wants us to be so righteous that the wages of sin is death. God, that is true, but there's the great contradiction. God is so full of love and so full of mercy that while we were still bad, Christ died for us. You know, that's a little bit hard even for us here to understand. Even with all that's permeated our world about God. But for the people we live with, this is an incredible contradiction. God is just. God is justice. God is righteousness. The wages of sin is death. No, God is love. God is mercy. God died for us not because we became good first. God died for us while we were yet sinners. That's the gospel. That's the gospel you preach at this church. That's the gospel we preach out in Africa. That's the message we take. But how do we understand that incredible contradiction? You see, God is so majestic and so unfathomable. This is where it hits us, this impossible thing. That God who is so just is also the God who is so loving. You know, I write to Drew all the time. He gets my emails all the time. At the end of his emails, there's a little tagline these days. You know what it says? There is more mercy in Christ than sin in us. There's more mercy in Christ than sin in us. That's the incredible contradiction of this God. Now, there was something my grandfather taught me when I first was around with him. It's that sermons are different in Africa than they are in America. And the reason is that we're an oral culture. Everything is written here, and so you're used to a 3-point sermon, and it's all very logical, and it follows through. In Africa, it's an oral culture. That's why we have all the parables that Jesus gave. That's why the Old Testament is all the stories of the outworkings of God, because they also were an oral culture. And in oral culture, we bind everything to a story that you can see. So I can talk and talk and talk about the contradiction between God, who is so just, and God, who is so full of mercy and love. But I need to provide for people something that is right in front of them that they can see. And so that's where this ministry that God has given us of Village Schools gives me the great opportunity to do that. Because you see, every time we go to a village, we tell them, if you want a school, you have to give the land. Nobody's going to buy the land. You're going to have to make bricks, months and months of work. You're going to have to haul heavy stones, carry them on your heads, take them. It's so much work. You're going to have to get all this sand, all the water. We are not going to come and build a school for you. You are going to work for months and months and months, and everybody has to work. And that's the message of Village Schools. All those 87 schools, they're all built with incredible amounts of labor. Hard work. People have worked. And when we go and hold that meeting with them, we talk about all that has to be done. You all know about that. But during the meeting, we also talk about the fact that once the school is open, The school's for everyone. Everyone gets to come. No one is excluded. And so, of course, there's always someone eventually in every village who raises their hand and says, but that's not fair. The kid who comes from 100 miles away, his father didn't make any bricks. His mom didn't carry any water. That's not fair. It happens in every village. Because the truth is, it's not fair. But that's village schools. And you see, that allows us afterwards to point so clearly. You remember all the hard work we had to do? Everybody has to work. That is the law. Everybody makes the bricks. Everybody hauls the stones. It's the great contradiction, but then everyone is allowed to come. It's the great contradiction between the God of the universe who hates sin and the wages of sin is death, but then Jesus pays the penalty himself and he loves us all. And everyone who believes is saved. You see, we're able to take what is right in front of them that they see and take that and point to the understanding of how it is with the true God. You know, I told you about all those students who are in our schools, the unchosen ones. You see, there's another part that when we tell them that they're going to make all the bricks and they're going to haul all the stones and they're going to build all those buildings and all that, then we say, after you do that, then your kids are going to have to pay to come to school. Admittedly, they're all thrilled when they hear how much it is, because it's the equivalent of about $110, and they know that in the cities, the reason they can't send their kids is because schools are $600 and $700 and $800, and so $110 just sounds like such an incredible deal. But the fact is they have to pay the $110, and the reason is because all those schools that they build, they have to be able to pay their teachers. In America, we use a big, nice word for it. It's called financial sustainability. People in Africa haven't ever heard of the word sustainability. But there's a logic behind it for us, and that's what we tell everybody. You're not going to work to build this school and work all of this, and then one day, the school falls apart. We're not going to come back to America and tell everybody we need to pay all of these. My friends, we have over 800 teachers in all of these schools right now. You know, I would have a most miserable life if I had to come back to America and try and raise salaries every month for 800 teachers. It would be impossible. But we tell them in all the villages, you are going to pay those school fees so that you can pay your teachers. And the reason is that if you're dependent upon good people to give money to pay your teachers every month, one day they will get tired. And when they get tired, your school will close. And when your school closes, all the work you did will be for nothing. And so this is what it has to be. And we also say, you know, the truth is if you were to do that, and we had to keep sending money every month to that village in order to run that school, then you guys would keep on getting blessed over and over, and the blessing would never go to anybody else. And instead, you guys pay the school fees. And that means you can run your schools, and that means that if we have money that comes in, it can go to build schools in more villages, and we'll get more and more kids in. And so that's what it's got to be, and everybody knows it. But you remember I told you that I know that on Monday there will be more than 18,517 kids. I know that. And the reason is that our teachers will go out this weekend and they will find more kids. Now, the truth is the first kids who come when we open school each year, those are the easier ones. When you go further out and you go to the families that are poorer and poorer, it gets harder and harder. When our son Joshua, after all these years, he came back to see us in May, took him to the little village of Ntumbe in western Tanzania, which wasn't all that far from where he grew up. And he went to go see Frank, who is the headmaster at that school. And when Frank was introducing him to his students, then he introduced him to one of the kids whose name is Jeremiah. And afterwards, Frank told Josh the story of Jeremiah. He was just smiling. He said, Jeremiah's our smartest kid here at school. He works so hard. He said, I went to his village and I know poor people, but there's nobody poorer than Jeremiah's family. And they weren't going to have him come because they don't have any money. He said, so I told him I didn't have any money when I went to school either. Come. God will take care of it. You know who takes care of it? Frank does. Frank does. But you see, this is the great contradiction. If Frank had taken a job in the city, he'd get paid at least twice as much, perhaps 3 times the salary that he gets in village schools. But Frank takes the low salary, and then Frank goes out and finds the kids like Jeremiah. And Frank and the other teachers make sure that that kid has food to eat and has notebooks and pens to study. You see, that's how I can explain the great contradiction. When people try to understand the contradiction between this God who is so just and so righteous, and who says that the wages of sin is death, and this same God who is so loving and so full of mercy, that Christ died for us while we were still sinners. I can say, look, everybody's got to pay school fees, because that's the rules. And the school has to be sustainable, and all the teachers have to be paid out of those school fees. And that's why the salaries can't be high. That's why the salaries are low, because they're schools for poor people. But then those same teachers, they're the ones who go out and they find the kids at the very bottom. At the very bottom. And they bring them in. You see, that's a story that all these kids are living every day. And that's why with that story, then they can understand it. They can understand how God could be that contradiction. Because they live every day the contradiction. You see, I can talk all about village schools. And there's lots of people who look at it now. Even non-Christians look at village schools. How is it that these people can have more than 80 schools? How could this have happened? Well, the truth is we do an awful lot of planning. We write up strategic plans. We do all those. We work hard. We do all of those things. If there's any data to gather, we gather it. We do everything you're supposed to. It's all there. But there are some inherent problems with village schools. You see, if we had a model that said we were going to build schools for people, everybody would want us to come. There would be absolutely no problem with getting into any village if we said we would come and build schools for people. And that's why whether it's the government or it's other charities or it's people who are just studying this thing, they are greatly troubled by this. Why would people reasonably, logically, why would people agree to work for months and months, hard labor, and then pay school fees to send their kids to these schools? This is simply not logical. And that's why in village schools, there's the great contradiction. We are totally dependent upon people who do what you said, Drew, to pray for open doors. This is not that we're just saying pray for open doors because this is a nice spiritual exercise or that it sounds good. The fact of the matter is anyone who studies all of these great plans that we have and all the great programs and the way we write it all up, anyone who studies at it looks at it and says, there's a fundamental flaw in this model. Why would anyone agree to do this? Well, the reason is very clear, and we ask you to look in Colossians. That is the verse. That is what has led us to believe from the beginning that we should do this. Colossians chapter 4. Starting in verse 2, it says, devote yourselves to prayer, being watchful and thankful, and pray for us too, that God may open a door for our message so that we may proclaim the mystery of Christ. Listen, my friends, Paul would not have said that if the doors were not closed. The doors for village schools are closed. Let's be very honest, because the model closes them. The model that says that people have to work so hard to get a school, that's not a good model. Anyone who looks, whether they are Christian or non-Christian, they look at the model of village schools and they say, that cannot possibly produce schools. And believe me, if we said we were going to come to this church and ask you to come up with 5 good guys who would come out and build a school, we'd go out and we'd build a classroom. But we wouldn't build, more than 80 schools. But there is this contradiction. We ask people to pray that God would open the doors, that God would do a work in people's hearts so that a whole village of people would decide, we are going to do this. There is the great plan. And it's all dependent upon God opening doors. Secular people look at this and go, this is craziness. It cannot work. Well, it's 19 years later and it is working. But it's working because there is something happening that people do not see. It is people quietly in their homes and in their churches, it is praying that God would open doors so that we might share the mystery of Christ. And that is what is causing this to happen. There is a second very big problem with this model. How are you going to possibly get teachers to go to these villages? And listen, we're not talking about a country like America where there are lots of teachers. We're talking about the continent of Africa where we are lacking in teachers. We can't even get enough teachers to teach in good schools in cities. What would be a rational plan? A rational plan would be to come back to your church here and tell you about the terribleness of kids in Africa not getting to go to school, and tell you that in order to get teachers to go and teach in very remote locations, we have to pay them this amount of money. And so let's raise the money and let's pass the hat and let's come up with this money so that we can pay these teachers who will go to these hard places. That would be a plan that the world could see as doable. That we would raise enough money and then we would go and present to people a good salary to go to these places. And instead, what we have is asking Christian people to look at what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 9, where Jesus says, "The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few." And therefore, in verse 38, he says, "Pray unto the Lord of the harvest to send out workers into his harvest field." And so for 19 years, we have asked people to pray that God would send workers into his harvest field. And so guess what? We have over 800 of them. 800 of them. They have agreed to go to villages, many of which have no running water, no electricity. They're going to get paid half the salary they could get in the city, and yet they decide to go because God did a work in their hearts and said, go to that place. We do not have a plan B for this. It is the great contradiction with the great plans of village schools. Yes, we are going to work hard. We have people who will work very hard. We're going to try and open 6 more schools next year. And we're going to go out and we're going to try and find students to come to them. And if we said to everybody, and here are the salaries that we're going to pay to entice people to come, the truth is in some of these villages, you couldn't pay someone enough money to go to them. And I know because I've been there. And I've slept in those villages. You couldn't pay somebody enough. And yet while there are all the other schools in the cities with the high salaries and with the everything, and they are lacking in teachers because these countries don't have enough teachers, and we're not lacking for one teacher. How does that happen? It's the great contradiction. You look at all of our plans and programs and everyone looks at them and they can see the hole in it. You'll never get teachers. And yet for 19 years, we've had teachers. Why? Because people actually believe that what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 9, that it actually means something and that it's actually true and that Jesus wasn't saying something false. They actually believe that the harvest is plentiful and that the workers are few, and so they're going to ask God for a gracious favor. Don't let those people work so hard and then there's no teachers for their kids. And every year we have enough teachers. And every year when we have enough teachers, we not only can rejoice that all of our kids are going to get taught, but we can then again point to the great contradiction. Again, this shows us this majesty of the true God. God is righteous, and yet God is merciful and God is love. How righteousness and mercy go together, it's impossible to imagine. How you can have financially sustainable schools where poor people in villages pay the wages for the teachers. How can that possibly work? And it works because we find a few good people who are willing to pray and earnestly pray to God that He will supply teachers. You know, I have to tell you, my son Josh now is back here in the States. And he grew up in Tanzania. He grew up watching this dream. Godfrey and Emanuele were like his older brothers. Jane Rose was like his big sister. You know, Justin taught him how to drive a car. You know, he thinks Justin is just great. This incredible dream, these kids who were there from the village, and they were going to create village schools, and it was going to start all these schools, and he watched all of it happen. Then he comes back here to America, and he's helping out with things here, and you know, he goes and talks with some of these people at foundations here in America that are interested in village schools and this incredible thing that's happening. And those people, they not only look at the flaw in the model, the flaw, how can you make poor people work? They not only see how that just, we should have good open hearts. We should just give it all to them. And they're bothered by that. And this idea of thinking that somehow we're going to get teachers who are going to go to these really remote places and they're going to live off a little bit of money that they collected there. It just seems so, it's a flaw in the model. But the biggest part of the flaw in the model is that the people that God chose to do all this, they don't measure up to what the world's looking for. You know, we read from 2 Corinthians this morning. The treasures in earthen vessels. You guys know what that means? You know, the world looks out at the people who are doing all of this, and they want to see, do they have master's degrees in community development? You know who God chose to do all this? They were all kids from villages who weren't going to get to go to school. You know, Godfrey, Emanuele. That's who God chose to do this. Boaz, who started all these schools in Uganda, he's an orphan kid. You know, Drew, we ask people to pray for open doors. We ask people to pray for more workers. James tells us in the first chapter, verse 5, he says, if any of you lack wisdom, he should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to him. Godfrey today is running one of the largest educational charities in East Africa, educating more kids And he knows that by any standards, this job is too big for him. And it's too big for Alfred in Malawi, and it's too big for Austin in Zambia, and it's too big for Michael in Kenya, and it's too big for Boaz in Uganda. And what we have promised them is that we will find people who will pray that God will give you wisdom to make the right decisions about how to do all of this. And I love all these guys, and I'll never say anything bad about them, but the truth is they didn't go to fancy universities, and they didn't get fancy degrees. And they didn't have tons of experience before they took these jobs. They took these jobs because they believed that God called them to do it, and they believed that every kid should get to go to school, and they were going to do everything that they could do to see that it would happen, and they're running all of this. And that's the other big hole in this big model. You see, we should raise a ton of money, and then we should go and we should hire people who are really qualified. And instead, God chose people at the bottom. That's the incredible contradiction. And yes, I can use that again to point everybody in Tanzania when I want to share with them about the majesty of this God who is so righteous and so full of mercy. The wages of sin is death, but Jesus loves us. And we're saved by faith. That incredible thing, it's lucky the experts don't look at that because they would tell God about how that just can't work. And there's no joke about that because even Paul, he's like, so gosh, if grace abounds, then that means sin is going to be even more and more. I mean, everybody could poke holes in this way that God decided to do it. We can sit in judgment over God and tell him how he should have done it a different way. How it would have been so much logical to tell everybody in this room that you have to become good first, and then we'll let you in. That would be the reasonable and logical way to build a godly people, wouldn't it? But instead, Christ died for us while we were yet sinners. He died for us then. Yes, I can take all these things in village schools and I can use that to point, but I can also point it and say, look at what God has done. Look at what God has done working through people who simply obeyed his call. That's the message we give to all of our students. Yes, God can use you. He can call you to go someplace. And so, you know what? They just keep on going to more and more villages. And not just in their own country, they get on the buses and they go to Malawi, and they get on the buses and they go to Zambia, they go to Uganda, they go to Kenya, they show up in villages and they say, I too was born in a village. And I never thought I'd get to go to school. And I did because people made bricks and they hauled stones and they built a school. And it could happen for your kids too. Let's work. And somehow, because God has opened the doors to get them in there, somehow God does a work in those people's hearts. They build a school. They build it, we get it up, and then it's an incredible thing. There's no teachers there in that village, and there never could be because there never was a school, so there can't be teachers, but we get teachers who come. That's what this church has been a part of for 19 years now. So I come this morning to thank you. Let's pray together. Lord, I pray that you will do a work in our hearts also. a work in our hearts so that we would see the majesty and the awesomeness of who you are. So righteous and so full of love. So full of love. And I pray, Lord, that you would also do a work in our hearts to believe that you can use us right here in this community and all around the world. For I pray in Jesus' name, amen.